All right, so Norman, he was a native New Yorker. He was born in 1894, and a lot of people think, oh, wasn't Norman, a wealthy artist? But he was born poor in the tenements, bounced around the city. But by the time he got to high school, he was a prodigy. They finally realized, pulled him out of regular school, and he started going to the Art Institute of New York. By the time he was 19, he had his first professional gig with Boys Life magazine, which he kept up with for the rest of his life.
Wow.
And then by the time he was 21, he did his first cover for the Saturday Evening Post. And by the end of his life, he did 326. 70-ish of them he did here in this studio.
Wow.
And we'll go out and see that. But Norman got to Vermont. He was in New York. He was married. His first marriage only lasted a couple years. It didn't work out. There was a lot of social pressures being in New York. And after that marriage didn't work out, he went off to California for vacation, met his second wife, Mary, and brought her back to New York. And they had 3 boys, Peter, Jarvis, and Tommy. But Norman was still feeling the pressures of New York. They came up to Arlington just for a long weekend getaway with Mary, and he decided this would be a nice, quiet place for him to live. So his first home in Arlington was down this dirt road closer to Arlington, and he had a small studio there, but he burned that one down with his pipe ashes.
Oh, darn.
And so instead of going back to New York, though, he moved down the road to this house and built that studio, which we'll go see.
Wow. So for the Saturday Evening Post, did he approach them? Did they ask him?
Was, well, he had such a name for himself.
Oh, okay.
I'm sure that they reached out to him. He was working with some of the other artists who were doing covers. So they saw his talents and wanted him to be a part of that.
Nice. Thank you.
So Norman moved here, and he built a big studio with the big windows.
Wow.
So those are all the big windows facing due north, so it doesn't get any direct light in the studio, and he can use all that good natural light.
Smart.
For painting.
Wow. Looks newer than that too. I wouldn't have guessed that old.
So yeah, when Norman was here, the little building that was just a farm out building, and that's the one he turned into the studio for his 3 boys.
The one on the left.
And he built the big studio.
Wow.
And our house over here didn't exist. When Norman was here, that was a tennis court.
Wow.
Norman liked to play some tennis.
Did his boys paint? Were they artists too?
That's a great question. They were all artists in their own right. Jarvis, when he came to visit, I asked him how it was being an artist, being Norman's son. He said, well, why do you think I quit painting? Because it was hard to be Norman's son. So he stopped drawing and painting and got more into modern arts, mobiles, and kind of modern things. Peter, he was a sculptor, so he ended up spending a lot of his life in Rome working for the church.
Wow.
And redoing sculptures and things. And then Tommy, he was a writer. So Norman's wife Mary, she was younger. He met her, but she went to Stanford in California. She always wanted to be a writer, so kind of that's why Tommy picked up that baton and wanted to write. And he wrote a book called How to Eat Fried Worms, which sold millions of copies, and we all had to read it when it's like a 5th and 6th grade book, and it's still in print. And he did very well with that, and wrote some other children's books.
Wow.
So they were all artists of some sort.
Was his wife's works published at all?
No, she never got to write.
Oh, she never did?
No, because by the time she was 14 years younger than Norman, and when Norman met her, then she was spending a lot of her time supporting Norman. So she never had the opportunity to write.
That's a shame.
It is a shame. And the house next door, which is a sister house of this house, but when Norman lived here, the Edgertons lived here. And you'll hear more about them in the studio. But they were really just poor dirt farmers, you know, doing whatever they could do to survive when Norman the rock star moved in here. So their lives were very much changed when Norman moved in.
For the better, for the not?
Oh, for very much the better.
Oh, good. Good. Wow. So before we walk in, what is this space used for now?
I'll show you.
Huh.
So we've redone that to make it as it was when Norman painted in there, because it was in really sad shape. After Norman left here in 1953, it kind of just went into being like a long-term rental space. So when we bought it, we wanted to put it back together the way it was when Norman was working in here.
Wow. Wow.
So I mentioned the Edgerton family next door, and when we bought this space, October 2019, and then I was in the little studio in November draining the pipes and things because it wasn't yet winterized, and a car pulled up and an older guy got out of the passenger seat and introduced himself as Buddy Edgerton. He said, "Hey, I'm Buddy Edgerton," and I'm like, "Hey, buddy, what can I do for you?" And he started telling me his story about growing up next door, and then he pulled out this book, which is called The Unknown Rockwell, that he wrote about 15 years ago. And it's a book about, here's the Edgerton house right next to the Rockwell house. But this is a beautiful book, and it just talks about the whole family. The Edgerton family did a lot of modeling for Norman. Buddy specifically did. He was a Boy Scout in quite a few Rockwell paintings. So he wrote this book called The Unknown Rockwell. And when he told me that, you know, he showed me the book, and I said, "Oh, come on into the studio," which was kind of a mess at the time. And I told him we wanted to put it back together the way it was when Norman was working here. And Buddy was very excited. And he knew this place intimately because he spent a lot of time here as a kid. So he came in here and he pointed up here and he said, "You know, there used to be a deer head hanging in the studio. And it was a deer my mom shot. And Norman loved my mom so much that he put them out in his studio."
Wow.
And nothing was up there, you know, when we came in. But he said, "Well, nobody knows what happened to that one, but I have one my dad shot. Would you like that one?" Yeah. So his son Jim they still have a hunting camp up behind us up the mountain up here.
Wow.
And they brought that one down a month or so later, and we put it in the same spot that his mom's mount was hanging. And Buddy was amazing. He was around 90 at the time. He passed away a couple of years ago at 93. But his memory was just amazing. And I'll show you a picture of Buddy. He was just a very sharp, sweet person who was... So this is Buddy. That's Buddy. He stayed with us a few times, and that's him like just a couple of weeks before he passed away.
Wow, looking really good for 90-something.
Yeah, and he would drive through that bridge, and then he would say, "Kevin, when I cross that bridge, I'm home." But here's Buddy as a young man modeling.
Wow.
But he was all that. But as beautiful and as brilliant as he was always very humble. And
wow.
He's really wonderful. Can you see that? That's the young buddy.
Oh, wow. He's a good looking man.
Yeah, he is.
Wow. Oh. Oh. Sweetheart.
It was
Oh.
all that.
That's so awesome.
Yeah, so everything in here we try to keep in that 1943 to 53 bubble when Norman was here. And the Norman Rockwell Museum in Stockbridge has been great. They've given me access to their archives. So when I find photos of Norman working in here, they're happy to share.
Wow.
And
That's fantastic.
it's really cool. And also the pictures of him working in here have been very helpful for me to kind of help, put this place back together.
That makes sense. Wow.
This
Wow.
is pretty good for some listening things.
Imagine the acoustics are amazing in here. Wow. So was that an extra? What is that room for?
So,
Or what was it for?
When Norman was here, that wall didn't exist. That was
Okay.
open. That was his storage area.
Okay.
And the back room was his workshop and dark room.
Okay.
Because Norman painted everything through photos. So he'd bring his models in here. His photographer was Gene Pelham at the time. Gene would get the pictures. Norman would play the director and set them up however he wanted them. Gene would get the pictures. Then Norman would, he'd sit in here, and any one of his single paintings, he'd have 25 or more separate photos to work off of to make the one painting.
Wow.
So yeah, this is a great book. This is called Norman Rockwell Behind the Camera, and I never knew any of this before, but it really shows his process. So, for instance, this painting, which is called Going and Coming, to do that, he would have all these separate reference photos to work off of, and so
Wow.
as you can see. And this book is also helpful for me to see what was in the room. And here's Buddy's grandma who lived next door. And Buddy was cute. He'd say, she's the only one whose expression didn't change in the original painting. And Buddy would say, well, Grandma only had one expression. She was always sucking on a pickle. So, Buddy, that's not very nice. But yeah, so this is just a great book and helps me understand how he worked. And really, Norman's most iconic work was done here. This painting, Saying Grace, I think it sold for $47 million. But it shows, so this is, these are the windows behind you. So he'd bring in the models. This is his son Jarvis when he was young. And then he would take these and, and do his work. So I always say, the light in that $47 million painting is this light. So at some point when I go for some grant money, I got to show them we need to take care of these windows.
Wow.
Not replace them, we just need to restore them.
It makes sense to use models to photograph them rather than having to sit and paint them for hours.
Yes, exactly. But it also, I'm always amazed because if he's got, using all those separate photos to come up with one painting, it takes a lot of brain power. You're synthesizing a lot into one.
True.
This book is great. This is an oldie but a goodie. Norman Rockwell illustrator. But I love this one specifically because it shows, this is a visit to Norman's studio, visit to Rockwell's studio.
Oh, wow.
And I love Norman's sketches, his doodles, and how he thought of his studio as his factory. But he had a great sense of humor, and plus the photos of him working in here, which are also very helpful.
Wow.
But this is great. So that's the little bridge in the church in front of the inn.
What's the name of the covered bridge, do you know?
It's the West Arlington Covered Bridge.
Oh. Richard Lynn.
And this is Norman's family when he lived here with Mary, Jerry or Jarvis, Tommy, and Peter, and their puppy. And then I was telling you about Norman's studio burning, and he sketched this, which is a whole story about the original studio down the road burning, which is great. And as much as he lost, because he lost work and he lost a lot of props and things that he would keep for the models, but he always had such a great sense of humor. And then Rockwell's new studio. And it's great to have all those photos too. That's where you are now. And it's great to have all those as reference pieces.
Absolutely. So he would have been in his 50s?
So he was, in his 40s, early 50s while he was here. And he left here in 1953, and he went down to Stockbridge.
Wow.
So we do have 2 rooms in here. The upstairs room, you can book rooms here. You don't get to book the whole building because the space is common space.
Okay.
This is Norman's space, You're not good enough to be able to have that. But you can have the back rooms, so that was his dark room.
Okay.
And then this part of the suite was his workshop.
Wow. Look how tall that is. Wow. Imagine he sat at this place.
Yeah, so that was his workshop table, and he was I think he was about 6'2".
Okay.
Yeah, he was tall.
He was tall and thin.
Yeah. I like this. Little steps. steps for like a little miniature person.
I'm sure they were full of paints and stuff at one point.
Yeah, I can see that.
These are the steps we're talking about.
For the miniature people.
For the miniature people. Yes.
The little mini elves,
we have to take care of them.
The Shire.
Wow. Beautiful space. Wow.
Yeah. When we moved in, that was my office for a while, and then my wife was like, well, we could really use that. She was right. But it was a great office. But now it's better that it's a room.
She was right, you got that on film.
Oh, that's right. I am filming. Wow. Where does the door go? Is it a closet?
The basement.
Oh, the basement. Okay.
And there's a cute story when so his photographer Gene Cohen, Gene's daughter stops here once in a while, Chicky, and Chicky was a little girl when her dad was working in here, so she obviously she knew this place, and I asked her, I said, well, you're a little girl, you would have known what this little cubby is for. You're a little kid, you're gonna be in there, you're gonna open that, you're gonna know what it is. And she told me a story that Norman was such a neatnik. When he'd bring in horses and canoes or whatever in here for the shot. Once he got the shot, though, he wanted this place spick and span. He was a real neatnik. So she said he kept his Electrolux in there. And I said, And I was telling that story to a guest, and she said, well, I'm cleaning out my mom's apartment, and she's got an old 1950s Electrolux. Can I bring it and put it in Norman's studio?
Oh, how cool.
So she did. And
wow.
I love that old 1950s blue.
Yes.
And of course it still works.
Of course it does, because they were made to last.
Not like the 18 vacuums I've gone through in the past 5 years. But it's pretty cute. And so
wow.
that's what we've done here.
How long has it taken you to amass the items that you've seen in these photographs?
Well, because of COVID.
Oh, that's right.
So it did give us that gift of time. So actually, we bought it October 2019, and our goal was to be open in April of 2020. And we had finished the main building, but we hadn't got to the studios yet. But because we couldn't open, it just allowed us to keep moving and finishing things. Because our original goal was, we'll get to the studios in November of 2020 when it's quiet again, and we'll get back to work. And in a sense, I tell myself that it was a godsend, because instead of stopping the project and then opening as an inn and then stopping again and starting to do this, we were able just to keep going, which does help, because I don't know if I could ever find that energy. Once you stop, it's hard to get it going again. So we had this all done by I want to say the fall of 2020, when we had everything finished.
Wow.
But we were able to open in June of 2020 for Vermont residences only.
Nice.
That was very helpful.
Yes. Please, we need some money.
So we had a very slow opening, which was fine.
Wow.
So it all worked out.
So do people come here in the winter?
Yep, we get people. We don't close, so we're
Okay.
There's stick season and mud season. This is our quietest season. We're busy on the weekends, but not so much during the week at this point. But people start to come, for skiing and winter sports. It's pretty popular. And then we get into mud season at the end of March, which is another quiet season. But we've teamed up. We're right on the Battenkill River, which is a world famous fly fishing river. We've really kind of worked into the fly fishing community. So we get people from all over the world that come for fishing. So and that opens up in April. So that's really helped our April out.
Oh, fantastic.
And then we get into, mid-May, and then you're off to the races. And then, through October. October is crazy. We get about 160 bookings for October. And then you hit the end of October, and it's much quieter, which is nice. It's a good break.
Mm-hmm. Well, we charge a bit, gearing up for the holidays.
Yes, yeah. And plus there's always work to, catch up with, There's always something.
There is always something when you own the property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it keeps you busy.
Keeps you young.
It does. That's when we decided to do this, and I was in kind of corporate benefits technology work, and I was 56 at the time, and when we decided to do this, it felt very good to shut the laptop screens, take off the headset, and get back to work.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there's a cute story over this. I don't know if you've heard this, but when Norman was here, I told you about the other artists who were here. One of them was Don Tracky. Don Tracky was also the artist behind the comic strip Henry, who is a little bald boy, bald and deaf boy who was in the comics. But Don Tracky, this is a painting Norman did called Breaking Home Ties. And Don Tracky loved this painting, and he didn't want this painting to leave the valley. So finally, he bought this from Norman in 1963 for $900. And he kept it here. But then a few years later, he was going through an ugly divorce, and he didn't want his wife to get her hands on this. So Don, knowing Norman and being an artist, he painted an exact copy of this, gave that to his wife.
Oh.
He took the original and hid it in his own. He had a studio down the road. He built a false wall and hid the original in his studio.
I remember reading that story.
Yeah, it's great. And then about 15, 16 years ago, and then he passed away, and he never told anybody. His wife actually gave the fake painting to the Norman Rockwell Museum, and it was so well done that they authenticated it as original. And that could have been the end of the story. But then a lot of people were still questioning the museum, and then Don and his brother Dave were cleaning out, Don Jr. was cleaning out his dad's studio. They found the false wall, opened it, found the original. They were able to auction it off for $15 million, and that was the story. But so this drawing over here, while Don Sr. was doing the fake, he painted this for a local event and released it to the public. But this is his comic character Henry.
Okay.
And he painted himself in as the farmer. But poor Henry's going off to reform school instead of state university. But it's pretty cute, and it's a great local story.
Wow.
So yeah, Little Arlington was
A happening place.
a happening spot at the time.
Absolutely. Wow. The talent. I mean, that's just, wow, the talent.
Yeah, I mean, this space has a lot of, it's a very active space. So we welcome, artists to come in and work, paint, sing, whatever they do. It's nice to have this, it's a studio. So it should be, it's got a lot of good energy in here.
Do you have an artist in residence program?
I don't. I work with a few artists. One of them, we get a lot of people who just kind of show up, and I can tell sometimes they're reading the sign in front, and they look like they want to. So I go out and talk to them, and one of them, his name is Gary Blevins. Gary was on his way from Ohio to drive out to the Maine coast. That he had been a big Rockwell fan all his life and painted a lot of Rockwell type things. And he was reading the sign, and I could tell he wanted to see the studio. So I said, come on in. And then I told him, I said, well, Gary, if you want to paint in here, you can. And he was so excited. So he sat down here for 3 days and 3 nights and painted. And I said, what are you going to paint? And he looked out the window and he said, well, I'm going to paint what I see. And then I'm going to paint Norman walking out to his studio. So he painted that in about 3 days.
Wow, in 3 days. Wow.
And went on his way. Yeah, he's pretty spectacular in some of the stuff he does.
Wow. I couldn't even do a paint by number in 3 days.
He's cute. He's like, well, it's not my best, but 3 days.
Wow.
But Gary, he was so excited. So he's been back several times. And I was telling you about some of the former models that come back here. One of them is Mary Whalen. Mary, you would recognize as the girl. She was the Shiner, the girl sitting outside the principal's office with a black eye. So that's Mary as a little girl. This is Mary now, when she stops by, sitting in here. She's wonderful. Gary was so excited to come and meet her, so he met Mary, and then he painted older Mary with younger Mary in the same picture, which is really cute.
Wow.
So, yeah, you never know who's going to stop by.
No, you really don't.
And we had people, there was a guy, he called me, he wasn't staying with us, and he asked if he could see the studio. And he shows up the next day, and he's an older Indian guy. And he shows up with his extended family, and he walks through that door, and he started to weep. And I'm like, oh boy. But then he gathered himself and he told me his story about being a little boy in India, and through magazines and illustrations, Rockwell's illustrations, he wanted to come to America because of the illustrations that he saw that Rockwell did.
Wow.
So he did come to America.
Wow.
And he was so humble. Then I find out not only is he a nice old Indian guy, which he is, but he's a world-famous heart surgeon, parts and patents, and he's a big deal.
Wow.
But he was just so humble walking through that door, and so sweet. And that's happened a few times, especially people have that generation because they remember, and it means a lot to them.
Wow, it's amazing.
Younger kids, they don't always know. They know Norman's name. They know the paintings. They don't always put them together. But depending on how old they are, especially if there's like a late 20-something-year-old woman or something, and I'll ask them, I'm like, oh, well, do you know Lana Del Rey? Like, oh, I love Lana. And I said, oh, well, what was the name of her album 2 years ago? And they're like, oh, it was Norman fucking Rockwell. That was the title of the album. And not that any song had anything to do about Norman, but it was a lot about middle America angst and that kind of thing. So they get the connection. So when people are asking me, are you afraid of Norman ever kind of going out of style? So well, he's in America's consciousness. He's in our ethos. He'll always be around in some way.
Yeah.
So, and I believe that. So, yeah.
Wow. Absolutely amazing. Where did he leave? So in 1953 when he left, did he go back to New York City?
That's a good question. No, Norman left here in 1953. He didn't tell anybody he was leaving. He didn't tell the Edgerton family. He didn't tell his photographer, Gene Pelham, who worked for him for 13 years, 24/7. He just kind of gave Arlington an Irish goodbye and left.
Wow.
But he did that because, while Norman was here, as the locals would say, well, poor Mary, his wife, was troubled.
Was what?
Troubled.
Oh, troubled. Mm-hmm.
So she had some, she was going to Stockbridge to an institute for therapy, for help.
Oh, wow.
So when he left her, and in 1953, you didn't talk about that.
Right.
You're not going to talk about your wife's problems. So he left, very honorable reasons. He went down to support her, but didn't tell anybody. He just left.
Wow.
And but he, being Norman, he didn't miss a beat. He moved to Stockbridge, built had his own studio, got another photographer. And when Melinda Chicky was here, I asked her, I said, well, how was it when Norman left here? And she said, well, that's a great question. People just want to know about Norman, but after Norman left here, she said, my dad was never the same. That, we were all walking on eggshells after the rest of his life because he felt abandoned, and, he worked 24/7 for Norman, and that was also his sole source of income.
Ooh.
So that's kind of he felt abandoned.
Wow.
But Norman, Norman being Norman, he was very driven and kept on going.
Wow.
So then I think he passed away in 78. So he did well.
Wow. Wow. Amazing.
So yeah.
Wow.
And we leave the music playing because Norman loved classical and opera. So if Norman wants to come back in here, we want to make him feel welcome. He can come on in and sit down and get to work.
Wow. I always know I'm in an amazing place when all I can say is wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we feel very fortunate that we were able to. I feel most fortunate to be able to come in and have contact with some of the people that he worked with and knew him directly, and get that firsthand knowledge from those people.
Absolutely.
And we did it by, the hair on our chinny chin chins. Those people are disappearing, and
It's divine timing, for sure.
yeah, that's crazy. that's our story.
Yeah.
So you'll have to come on down and stay with us.
It's
We'll make you
indeed.
breakfast.
I saw your website. It's sumptuous photos
Thank you.
and food. I mean, well, yeah,
Yeah,
amazing.
we've got, we redid our website. Yeah, we've got a great guy who moved up here from Charleston, South Carolina, and he does great work.
Yeah, clearly it's a gorgeous website. Wow.
This place, it seems like when we stayed here, there's always like really cool people staying here too. Like we always meet really neat people when we're here.
It's a pretty eclectic bunch.
It is. We're all a bunch of weirdos.
I mean, you never know. I mean, the people, you know, we marketed it. You want to get people of all ages, which is great because, you know, we'll get younger folks who are here to go hiking and stuff, and they get sucked into the studio stuff. And then you get older folks too. So really, it's kind of, you know, mid-20s to, I think we've had like 94-year-olds come up and stay. And it's always pretty cool. And it's always great to have, you know, making 94-year-old people smile is always, it's always great. They'll come in here and they're pretty happy.
Absolutely. How could they not be? If nothing else, they would recognize the dial phone.
They feel very comfortable. Yeah.
There's so much to see in here too. You sit here and you go, oh, I don't remember seeing that.
Yeah, there's a lot of little stories.
Yeah.
That little bust on the table, through some of the old photos, I found, and I said, oh, there's, you know, little black and white pictures. I'd blow them up, and I'm like, oh, there's a bust there. And then I had to blow it up, and I'm like, oh. And I'm like, well, that's Hermes. And there's a picture of Hermes. Well, the pictures that I took that from. So, for instance, in this, where is it? Right here. So when I blow that up, and I identified it, and I found. So then I went online, and I found that exact same bust. So I got that to come over from Greece last spring.
Wow.
And I told the Rockwell Museum because they had that misidentified as a different Greek god.
Oopsie.
So I said to them, no, they said, oh, it's Hermes. And I sent them all my backup information. He said, thank you, but I'm not sure you're really that. I'm like, you might want to just correct what you have in the museum and identify it correctly. Yeah, and it's like trying to find like that boat, you know, I'm like, oh, yeah. Norman had a boat like that. So I had to go find that boat. Yeah, you can get lost in here, which is good.
Now, have you written any books about this place?
No, I have not. I don't have time for that. But there's been some great books written. This book came out last spring. This is called Norman Rockwell's Models In and Out of the Studio by Steve Haggerty. And Steve wrote this, and there's Mary Whalen. It's really just about the models that were here in Arlington. So we had a book signing here last spring. And we had about 5 or 6 of the models came for that.
Wow.
And our friend Gary Blevins was here, and it was pretty cool.
They must be in their 80s and 90s now.
Yes,
Yeah.
the youngest ones are in their 80s, mid-80s. And yeah, that's why we lose them all the time. So
Right.
people are like, oh, you should still have a model reunion. And I'm like, that's great, but I'm just happy. They've been interviewed a million times by now, and I just want them to come in here and enjoy it. I don't need to. I've got their stories in books, and I've seen them all in news clips and everything. I just want them to come in and relax and they can tell me their stories. And I'll try to remember.
Oops. Yeah, I remember when I first walked in, I was saying that my friend's mother, a lot of her friends were models, so I think that's very cool. I never would have known that had my friend not mentioned that. So.
Yeah, and I mean, he was so prolific. I mean, his Gene Palm, his photographer, he also helped him find a lot of the models, and they'd scour, not just Arlington, but Manchester, parts of New York, all through the state to find people. And then they'd bring him back here. And Norman was always everything you read, his autobiography and all the books, and they all just have great things to say about him. What a gentleman he was, and how good he was with the models.
Wow.
And he'd give them $10 and a Coke.
A good amount of money.
Yeah, it was a good chunk.
Yeah.
And I think the kids were always most excited about the Coke. He had a Coke machine in the back room. He drank a lot of Coca-Cola, so he was pretty wired up on caffeine and nicotine from his pipe. And he was a pretty wired guy, I think.
Prolific, yeah.
So prolific.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what, when other artists come here, they always, and most of them are not illustrators, but they do landscapes and things. But, painting is tiring in its own way. Mentally, it's taxing. And they're just in awe of, just how perfect he was, but then just how prolific he was. I mean, he was in here, that's what, Mary was trouble, but Norman was in here most of the time. When Jarvis came to visit me, he would tell me, he'd be like, well, Dad's drawing his wonderful paintings of Christmas and all that. He said, well, the reality was, Christmas morning we had to come and drag Dad out of the studio so he'd be present. And I said, yeah. There's a lot of very successful, talented people that are just driven. He certainly was. But he also felt the obligation. He was born poor, and he felt that burden of he had to work. That's what he did.
Absolutely.
So,
wow.
Yeah. I'll send you a clip too. About 15 years ago, PBS did a really nice documentary on Rockwell for their American Masters series. And it's maybe a 3-hour-long documentary, but 45 minutes of it is Rockwell in Arlington, which I've kind of clipped. So it's just that piece of it. But it's really nice. It's really well done.
Wow.
And it gives you a nice... it's got really great narrators and all the guys with the beautiful voices narrating it. It's really nice.
Wow.
I'll send that to you.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, thank you. Wow. Anything else to say in closing about Norman Rockwell?
No, just every day that I'm always surprised by something, find out something. He was a brilliant man.
And shared his talents with the world. This is Patricia, and I'm Traveling for History. Thanks so much for coming along today. And I'd like to thank our wonderful tour guide, Kevin, who owns all of this beautiful property here in Arlington, Vermont. And until I see you again, I hope you have a fabulous rest of your day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.